The sea took the sun before the day had truly woken, swallowing the last pale sliver of it, and left Dragonstone outlined in a patient bruise of violet light. Wind breathed along the basalt spires and made a brush of sound against the carved gargoyles, so that the isle seemed to murmur to itself in a tongue older than men. That was the hour Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen preferred, the hour when everyone else still dreamt, and the world leaned forward to listen. She stood on the eastern battlement of the Sea Dragon Tower with her cloak drawn close, and watched the swells comb the black strand below. Watched the lanterns of the harbor boats burn like orange seeds in a bowl of ink. Behind her, the dragon shifted, the low ripple of scale on basalt, and a whiff of breath like a blacksmith's bellows damped by velvet. Valix was young by the countings of the Freehold, no more than a century hatched, and wore the night as if the night had chosen him. A hide soft as soot, wings veined in pale smoke, the crests of his head purled faintly when the wind lifted them. He had flown before the conclave 3 times and curled to sleep on the steps of the Hall of Feathers at least twice. And in both places his presence had made the oldest among the 40 very suddenly young. That had been before they chose Rhaenyra for Westeros. That had been before oaths were inked, before the glass candle's green flame had leaned toward her hand like a cat. "Be still," Rhaenyra said without turning, and Valix huffed again and lowered his head to the stone, the furnace of his throat quieting. Dragonstone smoke had a different perfume from the dark shore of Valyria. Less of brimstone and ripened earth, more of salt and kelp and the close breath of the tide in caves. She had been born in the Freehold and could recite the streets of Valasar and Oros and Illyria like prayers. But Dragonstone had made a peculiar home of itself in her since they sent her westward. A home composed of sounds and currents of air, of halls that knew her tread, of strange tenderness found in basalt courtyards, where old snow lingered in shadows, even when footsteps came behind her, measured, unhurried. Only one man in the keep walked like that, as if time would wait with courtesy for him wherever he chose to arrive. Rhaenyra did not turn until her grandsire's hand set itself, light and sure, upon the crenel, the worn gold of his rings gathering the dim light coins cupped against a candle. Aenarion Targaryen wore his hair unbound even in weather that counseled braids, white gold and thinning, a cloud that the wind took its time with. His eyes, old and unyielding, held the pale of blue glass. Age had knit a parchment's web at their corners, but there was no tremor in him. When he looked down at the harbor, the lanterns seemed to draw themselves upright. "They are late," he said, and the wind stroked his voice into the sea. "Or perhaps I am impatient. They carry Old Town with them," Rhaenyra said. "Old towns do not hurry." "It is not Old Town I wish to see first," Aenarion replied, and at last she turned to him. "Their envoy is Hightower blood, I am told," she said, "and the Citadel's gray men ride in his shadow, and a septon with a cloak like dusk." "And the small ones," Aenarion said, "the fishers, the children who point at the dragon and forget their name for bread. Those are the first who will decide if we are what we say we are." He was silent a moment. "Come away, sweetening. It is cold, and you will need all your warmth today." They descended the stair, their steps saddled with centuries of other steps. Torches made a gold seam in the stone that barely moved when the wind shouldered the slit windows. The sea dragon's lower hall opened out like a mouth that had something to sing and had forgotten the words. There the household had set platters of oat cakes and honey, and a pot of tea that had the clean scent of mountain leaves, carried from a reach hillside by men who had not been born yet when Rhaenyra's grandmother soothed her first dragon. Aenarion took only tea. "The wind is west," he said when he had warmed his hands over the cup. "Let it carry the words I want you to find." "I know them," she said mildly. "I know you know them," he said. "Tell me them anyway." She looked at the steam, then at the curl of it against the cold air. "We come as guests. We will not accept fealty. We will not draw swords first. We will build with our hands before we ask payment. If our dragons fly, they fly over open sea or open stone, and their fire kisses no man's house. We ask to trade for timber and iron and wool and wheat, and we pay in coin and craft and knowledge. We ask for quiet ground on which to set our hearths. And we promise to lift roads and bridges where the land asks for them. Our physicians will learn and teach. Our smiths will not unmake what makes you you. Then Anarian's mouth made a shape like the idea of a smile. And then it was a smile. Good. Now say the words for yourself. Not for the conclave. For myself, she said. I want a place where the wind tells me things I do not know yet. I want to see a river I have never seen, and be allowed to love it. I want to sit with a maester, and a septon, and a hedge witch, and share a pot of stew, and be shown the names men give to stars. And I want to lay my hand on a stone older than our oldest story, and feel it remember me. Nor. You will not be alone, Anarian said. Even when you think you are. Remember that. And when you are loved, remember not to be careless in it. He set down his empty cup. The dragon's head, high as the second-level arch, tilted to watch him with an eye that reflected fire to the size of a coin. Anarian reached up, palm out. Valix lowered his great jaw to the level of Anarian's fingers, the weight of potential in him more rumor than threat. In the old tales, a dragon measured the truth of what was said in its presence. In the new tales, men had learned to measure themselves against that gaze and find whether they could stand. Tell him too, Anarian said. Nylara set her palm against the dragon's cheek, under the ridge where the scales grew fine as seed pearl. No fire today, she said, and Valix breathed, and pressed his face very lightly into her hand, like a mountain stooping to be polite. The bells in the harbor rung then, not the sharp iron of alarm, but the soft-tongued bronze that belonged to the pilings and the pilot houses. Wind turned their notes into something like river water slipping past a root. The envoy had been sighted. Servants moved like sewn threads, looping the hall with motion. Nylara took her cloak again and followed the path she knew blind to the quay where sea salt varnished everything, and the ropes had a life like snakes at rest. They came in with the tide, 3 cogs with sails run up to spill the morning, and 4 long low galleys with sweeps at rest, their sterns straight-backed, proud. The outermost bearing the high tower standard, tower argent on smoke gray, had the clean spare look of a ship kept ready for need rather than paraded for want. On the high stern stood a man in a mantle of wool, the color of slate, too thin to be southern summer, and too warm for Dragonstone's chill, if the man were unused to it. He stood straight despite the wind. At his back, a septon, in dusk blue, clasped his hands over a chain with 7 metals, and between them and the helmsman, a gray-robed figure tucked his chin into a collar edged with barely visible silver keys. They landed without chatter. The Hightower man came first across the plank and set his boots on Targaryen stone. He had the look of the Reach about him, thorn-born or wheat-fed. Dark blonde and taller than he knew what to do with. A nose that had been broken once, perhaps twice, and eyes the particular brown of wet bark. Dragonstone, he said to the wind, and then looked at Nylara and bowed with a careful, precise courtesy that suggested he carried discipline about like another, thinner mantle. Sir Benedar Hightower, blood and bone of Old Town, sworn to my Lord Father who keeps the light and the law in that place. I bear greetings and a charter sealed by my lord and the Citadel's conclave. Nylara inclined her head. Nylara Targaryen, of Valyria, and of this rock. Be welcome, Sir Benedar. Your ships found us without fuss? Your harbor men speak to the sea like kin, he said. They gave us to eat what they had and refused our coin until we threatened to wrestle. We lost that argument. Our harbor men are stubborn, Nylara said. There will be stew for you above, and a bed near heat when you are ready for it. May I know your companions? The septon was young for the weight of his cloth, a lively, freckled face, and a small mouth that had to fight to keep from smiling. Septon Corwin, he said. I am charged with the keeping of words and ears. The gray-robed man had the face of a man who had trained himself to be a shadow until he had become one. Maester Lymond, he said. The links that made his chain glimmered. Black iron, yellow gold. White silver, pale steel. Lead that had no shine at all. A fragment of Valyrian steel that hardly dared darken the air. I am charged to listen to what is not said. If you will forgive me for the rudeness of such a charge. Do your office, Nylara said. I have no fear of silence so long as it is honest. Valix chose that moment to lift his head and look. The dragon's gaze can be a kind of weather. Sir Benedar did not bow under it, though Nylara saw the little tightening at the hinge of his jaw. The Septon made the sign of his faith in a way that asked not strength but permission. Maester Lyman's nostrils narrowed very slightly as the air moved. A craftsman measuring heat. You are very large, Septon Corwin told the dragon in a thoughtful voice that ignored rank and protocol. And yet your eye is smaller than an apple. He looked at Nylara. If I offer him bread, will he take my hand for payment? If you offer him bread without my leave, Nylara said, he will take only the bread and my displeasure. Ah, said the Septon cheerfully. Then I will offer him nothing at all. Something like amusement rippled through the gathered Dragonstone men. Nylara let the warmth of it into her chest. Up, she said to the envoy. We will eat, and then we will read each other's words. It was not a grand meal, because negotiations that begin with meat glazed in wine and towers of sugared fruit often end sticky and stained. There were stews, one of fish with fennel, one of mutton with barley. There was bread burned a little at the edges and butter that had not quite given up the memory of the cow. There were apples that had been touched by frost and kept for their sweetness in the cold room with the hams. And there were jugs of the island's thin red wine. It was a meal with enough in it to let hunger stop speaking. Under that quiet, other voices could be heard. The Hightower Charter spoke to measures and weights, and to where a market might be set, and how far from a sept a foreign shrine should stand. It spoke to where dragons might sleep, and when they might be seen, and it spoke to the rights of small folk who did not wish to be looked at by a dragon at all. The Citadel's letter spoke to the sharing of knowledge, and to what would be taught to whom and when. It was careful with its words in the way of men who know that careless words make fires, and fires always consume more than their first feast. Nylara listened. Anarion listened. Benedar spoke like a builder laying stone, one piece at a time, pressed into place with care, tested, then the next. Lyman's questions slid in like water finds a crack in mortar. Septon Corwin asked no questions, and yet seemed to require answers, by the simple fervency with which he watched their mouths move. By the time the sun had climbed and found the high windows, they had a beginning. We will set our first hearth on the Blackwater, Nylara said at last, when the talk had made a place for the sentence to exist. There is a hill there that looks toward 3 hills more, and the river is a patient thing that welcomes ships. There are villages near enough to trade and far enough to keep their own rhythm. We will call no banners. We will keep our dragons in sight of the sea. Benedar. You mean to build a city, Benedar Hightower said. There was no reproach in it, not even awe. It was simply a measurement. We mean to let a city happen, Nylara said. We will set timber where the ground is dry, and bring stone where the tide asks for walls. We will open our halls. Men will come if they choose. Women will come. Children will come if their elders think us not wicked. If no one comes, then we will have built a thing for the gulls to stand on when they tire. Mender. Cities do not happen by chance, Maester Lyman said. Cities are acts of will that pretend to be accidents. Nyalara's mouth moved as if remembering the shape of a smile. You have been to Valyria then, Maester? I have not, he said, and his voice softened so very slightly that the softness might even have been grief. I have read of it. I have read of it for 20 years. That is something like going and not at all like going. Come with us then, Nylara said. Read with your feet. They went not at once, but when wind and tide lifted mantles together. In those intervening days Nylara walked the island and let herself be known to it. She stood in the old smithy where one of the Freehold's joy-smiths had made a sword that sang when its edge spoke to stone. She sat in the smallest of the sea caves where barnacles studded the lips of the rocks like the teeth of small gods, and listened to water say its cardinal directions. She set her forehead against Valix's breastbone, and felt the slow second sun of his heart. At night, when the keep lay quiet, and even the cooks stopped their muttered romances with their pots, She sat in her chamber and lit the glass candle. Green fire rose, took no smoke, and burned with the thirsty steadiness of a woman reading by lamplight after her child is down. In its light, the contours of the world of men became very plain. Perhaps it was only that the eye, once given a single color to hold, learns to forgive detail the way a mother forgives her newborn's first assaults. Perhaps it was magic. Nylara had seen magic enough to know that often it resembled patience and practice more than sudden sorcery. She saw once the long river, with the high towers light a silver nail at its end. She saw once a wall like a fallen cloud, gleaming with the stubbornness of winter, and on it a single black bird moving against the wind. She saw iron ships on gray water whose sails had shapes like knives. These were not warnings. They were simply the way the world chose to show itself to a fire that asked it questions. She did not tell Anarion, not because she did not trust him, but because some visions are little seeds that need to be kept in the dark to sprout. The morning they sailed south and west toward the river mouth. Dragonstow's gulls followed them like gossip. The Valyrian ships that bore them wore the bright painted gaze of their house at their prows, eyes meant to watch shoals and shallows, and trouble concealed by a smooth sea. Valix took the air high above, no more than a darker seam in the clouds, content to be a rumor on a day when rumor would do. Sir Benedar stood under the fore-latine, and took salt on his face as if he needed to prove to the sea that he could be kin. Maester Lymond wrapped his chain in linen to keep the links from biting when the ship swayed. Septon Corwin discovered that prayer could be a way to keep from emptying your stomach into a bucket, and became very devout. Out beyond the Dragonstone headlands the sea changed, loosening its basalt perfume and replacing it with something that tasted of the reach even this far from shore. Wheat and grapes and the low steam of cow breath on a cold morning. Dolphins found them and played like children in the ship's beard. Once, far to the north, a black shoulder broke the surface and rolled, the great creature indifferent to their passage. They hugged the coast when they could, not because the dragon feared losing them. Nylara wore Valix like a thought that hovered just behind her ear, but because coasting ships gather stories easier than blue water ships do. At Darkland ports and in fishing coves, where the names of small gods are still carved into stone, Nylara sent men ashore with sealed letters and gifts that were too simple to be called bribes, and too well chosen to be insult. A mirror for a lord's daughter, a packet of seeds for a hungry hamlet, a wheelwright's tool that would last a lifetime for a village whose carts cried like beasts. At dusk on the second day the high tower began to right itself on the horizon. A thread of silver at first, then a needle, then a pillar. The river poured its sweet into the salt, with a sound like a particularly satisfied old man settling before a fire. The light at the high tower's top was not yet kindled, but the day gathered around the tower, as if to confer. "Home," Benedar Hightower said in a voice he would not have used if he had thought she could hear it. He added after a moment more loudly, "Forgive me. There are places that make boys of men. Valyria does that," Nylara said. "So does a mother's lap." "I recall that poorly," Benedar said. "So do I." She answered, and the way he looked at her afterward had a question in it that he did not ask, as if he understood that sometimes the thing you are not told is the thing you can be trusted with. Old Town was itself. Steep roofs like folded hands, olives and stone and chimneys. The great starry sept in its gown of colored glass, the citadel's low sprawl ringed with its towers, each with its own idea about how a tower should look. The river swarmed with smaller lives, punts, rafts, skiffs, watermen who knew every grain of the silt's voice. On the quay, 100 faces turned up like lilies when rain begins. Valix had been meant to avoid the city, skirting it to the south where salt marsh and reed could take his shadow without fear. But as the ship slid past the first wharves, a group of children in clothes that had had more owners than they had winters began to run along the river's edge, shouting, pointing. One held up a piece of bread as though offering it to the ship. The Septon made a noise suspiciously like a laugh. "Let us land," Nylara said. "A city should not be met with the back of the hand." They made berth by courtesy and by arrangement, and Septon Corwin stood at the head of the gangplank, and spoke to the crowd the way one speaks to a horse that has never been bridled. "Gentles," he said, and what might have been mockery on other lips was only music on his. "Gentles, the lady does not bite, and her dragon will not smell you so long as you keep your stew in your stomachs, as I hope to do." "You brought a dragon?" called a man whose beard modeled itself after broomgrass. The word ran through the crowd like a weather change. "We carry a princess," Benedar said, taking up the space in the air that men leave when fear steps in. "We have no room for dragons." "Then what is that?" shouted a boy and pointed to the sky where Valix, obedient and not, had curved once low as if the city were a forehead and he a blessing. He beat once and rose again. A clean black stroke, and the town's breath loosened as men and women remembered to lift their chests. Nyalara came ashore. The air smelled of ink and bread and rotting weed, and old fish and lavender hung in a lane to dry, and under all of it, the patient yeast smell of civilization. The first to greet her was not lord or maester, but a woman with a basket of apples, who pressed one into Nylara's hand and said, "You look hungry," with the unanswerable authority of a grandmother. Nylara bit the apple, and it burst its sweet and tart into her mouth, and the woman smiled as if a feast had been saved from a wolf. The Hightower's lord was a man with a beard like clean wire and eyes like doors left slightly ajar. He took her hands and looked into her face as if searching for a particular book on a shelf and said, "My father knew your grandfather, and he said he had never met a man who thought more of maps and less of walls." "The sea teaches that," Nylara said. "Walls fall, coasts redraw themselves. We have noticed," the Lord said dryly, and with that they were on ground where jokes could grow. He led them to a hall that smelled of beeswax and of the faint particular dust of things that are cared for. There were tapestries whose greens were the work of women who had loved olives. There were no swords on the walls. This was a place where swords were permitted to rest. The citadel sent 3 archmaesters, each with a chain that told a story different enough that they could argue with themselves without aid. One wore a link of Valyrian steel that flashed only when the light was too busy with other things. They spoke of teaching and of learning. And to Nylara's quiet joy, they spoke of both together, and were not shamed by the togetherness. The glass candles had been lit here once in living memory, and then gone silent. The Archmaester of the Green Link wished to see the one she had brought alive. "Not now," she said. Not because she feared them, but because she did not wish to lay small fires in a room already occupied by one great light. These were men who understood the husbandry of flames. They made the treaty there between bread and soup, which is where the best treaties are made. The words were not grand. Grand words invite envy. These words spoke of harbors and of how you tie a knot so that it will let a knot hole go when a boatman has frozen fingers. They spoke of when a market finishes and who cleans the fish guts and where the refuse goes so that children do not play in it. They spoke, too, of faith. The Hightower asked that no god be named a king under their sky. And Nyalara said the Freehold's gods had long since learned that they got further when men forgot about them. Septon Corwin looked thoughtful at that, and then later asked her, over the last of the apple tarts, if he might see the ritual by which a dragon is named. She told him there was none. On the 3rd day, given gifts that smelled of cedar and bees and leather, given permission in ink and in the safer permission of looks that trust a little, they left Old Town and went back toward the river that was not theirs and might be a little in time. Benedar came with them as his father's will, and the Hightower's interest made sense of. And so did Maester Lyman, who had remembered with his feet, and Septon Corwin, who had decided that the 7 had no objection to travel in good company. They found the Blackwater as Nyalara had seen it by candle, a slow brown animal rolling its shoulder into the salt. Its mouth foamed with old devotions of the tide. There were 3 hills that pretended they were not hills until you put your hand on them and felt their patience. The air smelled of mud and iron in a way that promised labor and reward both. A small town clung to the ailing pier like a limpet. Men looked up at their approach with the hard, spare gaze of those who have learned to believe in rumor only when rumor puts a coin in their hand. Women's aprons bore the dark blossom of berry stains. Children wore the universal clothing of children, dirt and hope. Nylara walked the shore, her boots accepting the suction of the mud and returning to air with small noises like permission denied and permission given. She squatted to set her palm on the earth, the way a physician sets fingers to a wrist, and listened. The river ran by with a patient insistence. The sea answered with its indifferent laughter. Under the little town's anxious chatter she heard silence, and she heard under that a desire to be allowed to change, the way a young woman might, if given the coin of time and safety together. Here, she said at last, and stood and looked not at the river, not at the sea. Here we will set the first stone. Stones, Maester Lymond said helpfully. Stones. She agreed. They bought timber from men who had not meant to sell it, and persuaded them they would not be the poorer. They paid 3 fishermen to run messages upriver, and they paid 3 more to tell those men's wives what those messages were. They set the bones of a hall in the simplest way. 4 rows of posts, 2 ridges, a roof pitched to teach rain how to leave. Benedar took off his mantle and lifted beams like a farmer, and Septon Corwin learned to swear in a way that closely resembled prayer and made men laugh without blasphemy. The dragon came down only once, and then in the long gray afternoon, when the wind had begun to talk of rain. He circled once, twice, 3 times, each lower than the last, the great black pages of his wings turning with stern economy. He landed on the far hill, and folded himself there with the decorum of a visiting lord, who knows better than to take a chair if he has not been offered one. The townsfolk went very still for a very long time, and then very slowly began to breathe. The children looked as if every song they had ever been told fairy tales by had suddenly stood and introduced itself. Nylara watched each face the way a gardener watches buds, and saw fear in some and curiosity in many, and something like pride in a few, as if they had been waiting for this moment to know that they lived somewhere where things like this could happen. The first stone was plain. Anarion had sent a more splendid one, carved with dragons, and with the sigils of a dozen freehold families, who wished, through a display of togetherness, to display themselves. But Nylara had left it in Dragonstone's yard, to grow less proud under rain. She chose instead a block of basalt, the size of a fat man's trunk, hauled from the beach by 6 men who afterwards stood with their hands on their thighs, and grinned at one another, as if they had done something worth having lived that day for. She set her palm against the stone, and spoke to it in High Valyrian, and then again in the trade tongue, not naming gods or kings, but naming simple things slowly. Door, she said. Bread, roof, road, river, light. Then she looked at Septon Corwin, who nodded, as if she had spoken the most devout prayer he had ever heard. And he said words that had fewer nouns and more hope, and it was good. Valix breathed once, a small breath by the measure of dragons. Flame ran his throat the way memory runs a wound. It touched the edges of the mortar, grit and ash and lime, and woke it to its task. No more would be needed. Fire in measure, like mercy. At twilight, with the first rafters black against a cloud-slick sky, guests came unsure whether they were intruders or the thing called for by the day. From Stokeworth, a woman with a mouth like a knife and a laugh like a bell came to see what she considered hers by right of nearness. From Rosby came a man who wore his nose like a banner and counted beams with his eyes and with his fingers both. From Duskendale a quiet man with ink on his thumb brought a letter that said nothing and contained a favor. They ate stew with the rest, and wiped their bowls with their bread, and asked questions as plain as nails and hammer. How many? Who pays? What if? Nylara answered in the same metal, and where she did not know she said so, and that was counted to her credit. That night, she slept in the half-built hall, on a pallet that made her shoulder feel its own bone, and she woke once to the sound of rain on new wood. a sound like a crowd that has decided to laugh. She lay still and thought of the 40, and their long room, and their talking that had thunder in it, and of Valyria's long, red evenings, and of Dragonstone's gulls and their argumentative hearts. She thought of Anarian's hand with its remembering rings, and of Benedar's voice when he had said home the way a man says his mother's name with his cheek against her breastbone. She thought of Maester Lymond carefully folding his chain away to sleep, and of Septon Corwin's whispered, entirely sincere apology to the Seven for praying so much to keep the stew in. She lit the candle and asked it nothing. It burned anyway. Its green was the green of certain coasts, of the oldest glass, of the gray spaces in men's hearts where envy and tenderness share a spoon. In the morning, as the river moved with the dignity that a river possesses when it knows it will one day outlast men, a boat out of the little town came pulled by a woman with shoulders like someone used to carrying sacks. With her stood a girl of 12 or so in a dress that had been her mother's, the sleeves cut and hem stitched with care and urgency. The girl held something in both hands as if it might break even if she were careful. "Princess," the woman said, and the word sat in the air without fanfare, neither currying nor challenging. "My Lana can read a little. More than me. Her father taught her letters before he went into the river last winter, and did not come out. The maester up at Rosby says he has no time for a poor man's girl. If you're to build here, perhaps you'll need someone to write down where you put your stones." Memswan. Now Alara crouched, and the girl regarded her with a frankness that belonged to children and to certain old men who had outlived vanity. "What have you there?" Nealara asked. "A book," the girl said, as if it were a confession. "May I see it?" The child looked at her mother, who nodded with the grave, terrified generosity of those who give you the only thing they have worth giving. Nealara took the book. It had begun life a ledger. The entries long since spent showed under the child's careful practice. Straight lines swallowed into round, numbers softened into names. There were letters here that told of bread owed and paid, of hooks bartered for wool, of cider for nails. Over them the girl had written the words she liked best, and under those the words she meant to like someday. River, rain, roof, light. Those are good words, Nylara said softly. They are yours, the girl said in a rush. From yesterday. Ah, said Nylara, who had not known that the world was listening so keenly. Then they are ours. Will you write them again for me? Better this time? And then write others when we have others we need? We will pay you with bread and with more words. The girl's mouth made the shape of a thing that had only happened to other people. The woman's chin came up, and her eyes filled, and did not spill. Nylara stood and took the woman's hand in both of hers, and put it between her own like a coal being banked. There will be a school, she said. There will be a house where no one is turned away from letters. If my men forget this, you come find me, and I will do the remembering for them. Then see. By noon the wind had changed, and brought with it a filament of sound that did not belong to river or to ordinary day. It was, at first, no more than the way metal speaks when stroked with a soft hammer. Then it was unmistakable. The song of oars. 3 ships slid around the reed-bent bend and came into view as if the river had chosen to cough them up. They wore no sigils. How they wore their sails showed them to be men who neither feared to be caught nor meant to be. Iron-born by the look of them, and by the way the river shrugged them under its chin, like a dog tolerating an insistent flea. Benedar moved without moving, meaning that the men he had placed for such a movement moved. Masts were nothing to arrows. The new-built hall was nothing much to fire, and yet meant so much that any flame would be sacrilege. Valix raised his head on the hill with the same patient interest with which a cat watches a moth. The small town went still again, but this was a different stillness, the stillness of teeth bearing inside closed mouths. Nealara held up a hand and felt the wind lay its palm against it, warm as a man's breath. She closed her eyes and counted very slowly to the number she would have been had Dany's first dream not drowned in the Freehold smoke. Opened them. The ships had edged nearer with a courtesy that was almost civil. A man standing on the prow of the first had a beard, as if he had told it to breed, and it had obeyed. He wore a coat of plates that had been polished with sand and stubbornness, until it had remembered to shine. He lifted his hand. Empty palm. No weapons visible, which meant all weapons present. River, he called, as if introducing it. Sea. Shore. He grinned without mockery. You build. We are guests, Nilara called back. We do not raid the larder we are invited into. Guests with dragons, the man said cheerfully. We are thieves with priests. The world makes room for contradictions when the cooking is good. Bendero. Do you wish to come ashore and eat poor stew and bargain badly? Nilara asked. We will let you beat us twice at dice before we ask you what you came for. The man laughed, and two of the longships laughed with him, a sound like irons shaken on a ring. We came to see whether the freehold comes with chains or with open hands. If the first, we would have shown you a river mouth does not love herons who pretend to be eagles. If the second, we would like to sell you nails that do not bend, and furs that do not rot, even if a baby sleeps against them and sweats. No. Come ashore, Nilara said. Leave your priests to bless your ships while you trade like decent sinners. And so they came. And so the first trouble passed not as trouble, but as commerce, which is one of the world's oldest ways of convincing trouble to sit down and listen. Benedar's men kept their hands light on their weapons. Maester Lyman counted nails with a care that suggested he would have noticed if one had been forged from a broken sword that had once belonged to a murdered brother. Septon Corwin blessed the stew in a way that contained no reference at all to the sea, which the Ironborn would have taken badly from a land priest. That evening, Nilara wrote her first letter to Anarion from the Blackwater. She did not have the paper she favored in Dragonstone, thin and stiff as onion skin, only a thick, forgiving stock that had once been a ledger and would forgive this too. She wrote of the river's patience and the way the hill accepted the stone as though it had been waiting for a weight to explain it to itself. She wrote of Benedar, who made himself necessary in the way of men who have stopped making themselves important. She wrote of a girl who would write their words for them until they had words of their own here. And she wrote of Ironborn who had taught their boots to step lightly on mud when the moment called for it. She did not write that the candle had shown her a wall of ice. She did not write that she had dreamed this river before it had shown itself. She wrote, at the last and without apology, I am very happy today, and I am very afraid, and both are true. The letter went north with a fisherman whose hands held 20 winters and a boat that had birthed half the town's children by carrying their mothers over water when walls could not be moved. The fisherman promised to kiss the dragon for her and laughed when she said no. Days did that thing days do when they pass not in idleness, but in the honest repetition of honest work. They became both long and short and left you weary in a way that made sleep an animal that comes of its own accord and lays its head down in your lap. Men arrived. Women arrived. Children arrived like birds, hesitant at first, and then suddenly all at once. A hedge witch came and asked where she might put her pot, and whether anyone minded if she kept geese. No one minded, and the geese minded less. A man with straw in his hair and an expression that suggested God had disappointed him, but only because God had not yet been put to the proper task, arrived with a cart full of hammers and proceeded to argue with the blacksmith, as if they had been friends for 40 years and had no intention of agreeing for the next 40. A woman with a scar that had altered her face without spoiling it came and opened a house where those who had lost something they could not name could leave their loneliness for a while and eat soup. The hall rose. A storehouse took shape with a door that even a greedy man would like, because it would promise him that what he set behind it would still be there the next day. A pier extended itself into the river like an arm, learning a new language. The dragon learned the shape of the hills and set his naps accordingly. He did not burn anything. At night, the candle burned, and often, Nilara did not even look at it, content to know that it would light the room where she slept, and where the girl Lana came in the afternoon to practice letters and drink sweet milk, and ask questions that no god had ever answered to anyone's satisfaction. Visitors came who were not merchants or fishermen or ironborn with politely sheathed teeth. From Highgarden, with a coach that had made the river road remember, it was a road, came a man with green eyes, and the particular arrogance of someone who is loved by something large and fertile. The gardener wore his hair long and his patience short, which is a kind of mathematics that works in summer and fails in winter. He called Nylara princess with the exact intonation that said lady would have done just as well, and offered to sell her timber at a rate that would have left even the most generous counting house fond but bankrupt. She spoke to him in the language of water and of time, and of the way roads are not made only for the men who first lay them, and he smiled as if he were a man shown a child's trick, and clapped his hands when the coin disappeared to have it from behind his ear. "Very well," he said. "I will give you oak as if I loved you, and charge you for it as if I am not a fool. Build your city and sell me your lawyers when they are ripe." From the west they came, with lion banners that did not flourish so much as lean and watch. The Lord of the Rock had in his mouth a line he had practiced in his coach and did not have the chance to use, because the first person he met was Septon Corwin, who asked him with perfect sincerity whether his hair behaved itself that day, and could he recommend an oil to tame a dragon's crest in a high wind. The Lord laughed, a short, shocked bark, and in that moment became merely a man who wishes sometimes to be irrelevant and is almost never allowed. From the Eyrie they sent a bird rather than a man, because they are mountain folk and trust feathers more than oars. The letter said, "We are watching. Nylara sent back on another bird watch with us, and we will tell you when there is something worth the watching." From Storm's End came a man whose mouth had been built to say no, and had not yet learned to enjoy yes. He measured the beach with his eyes and told her the sea would make her a liar if she promised this wall would stand forever. She promised nothing. He liked that and bought nails and promised storms. Later Septon Corwin asked him if his men had ever tried praying to the wind instead of cursing it and survived long enough to regret it, and the man grinned and said, "Once, and that was the beginning of a friendship that would lead to a story about a storm where bulls floated and a Septon learned the names of 7 different rains." From Sunspear came a letter that smelled of orange blossom and of something bitter under the sweetness. It was written in a hand that had been trained to look like a man's and had failed beautifully to do so. It said, "We do not invite guests who bring their houses with them, but we like to know the names of our neighbors' dogs." Nylara sent back, "The dog is named Patience, which is an untrue name to give a dog, and the dragon is named Valix, which is a true name to give a dragon, that means veil and fire together." And from the Black Tower by the lake there came no letter, because that lord believed letters were a way to let words escape their proper master. Instead there came, one evening, a woman alone on a small horse, with a saddle battered by use, and not at all by neglect. She wore her hair braided tight to her head, and her cloak was plain as bread, and when she swung down from the saddle, she moved like a man who has known both generosity and theft, and does not intend to be surprised by either again. She looked at the dragon for a time and at the hills for a longer one, and then at Nylara. "My master does not write letters," she said in a voice that had known formal rooms and rains both. "He sent me because he said the language of horses is older than the language of ink." "And what do the horses say?" Nylara asked. "They say the ground here is wet, much longer than it has any right to be," the woman said. "They say the slope to the river is sly and will send a cart to its knees if the cart is unguarded. They say the dragon will not eat them, which is a thing I did not say to them, for fear of making it untrue." "Tell your master we have listened," Nylara said. "Tell him we still remember how to be poor, and that helps with mud." The woman considered her for a long moment, and then nodded, which is a very slight thing that can carry in it a long mile of approval. "I will tell him." She said, and mounted and went with the same self-possession that had brought her, and disappeared into the company of the road and the dusk. The first festival rose, the first that was theirs and not borrowed. It was a simple thing, a day when work began later than it wished to, and ended sooner than was wise, and in between there was a market, and a dancing, and a stew that used up the last of the old apples and made room for the new. Valix did not fly. Instead, they built a great lantern from split bamboo and paper oiled with fish oil, and painted with a child's idea of a dragon. and they set it on a raft and pushed it into the river at evening. The river took it the way it takes obligations, not as a favor, but as a fact. The lantern went soft, and then smaller, and then a memory that had light in it. In the quiet that followed, Nylalera walked up the nearest of the 3 hills, and sat where she could see the beginnings of streets. They were nothing but intentions yet. Tracks pressed by feet, and then used because they were there. A house at their bend, a path to the water, a space that would be market because people had chosen to stand there and argue. That is how cities happen. That is how hearts learn their own maps. She did not light the candle. The stars were sufficient. Sharp and innumerable and entirely uninterested in their arrangements, which is perhaps why men love them. The wind spoke, and the grass remembered how to listen. Benedar found her as if he had expected to. "There will be trouble," he said conversationally, sitting at a polite distance and looking not at the dark where a dragon's eye had been, but at the little lights that still moved on the water where fishermen choose to be late. "There is always trouble." "Yes," she said. "There will be trouble." "You will bear it," he said. "We will bear it." She corrected, and he bowed his head because the pronoun had the weight of a blessing and the taste of a vow. Below them, the girl Lana ran across the new dirt with a piece of bread and shouted at the top of her lungs in high Valyrian to no one at all. "Door, bread, roof, road light," as if naming them would keep them. Which, in certain magics, is how you begin. As summer rubbed itself into late, the black water learned their names and gave them back until the names were worn smooth enough to fit comfortably in the mouth. Men who had lost wars elsewhere came and found that not all losing is the same kind of ending. Women who had been told they were too much discovered a place where muchness is a currency, not a sin. Children who had been called bastard and peasant and other half-true things learned new half-truths. Student, apprentice, writer, runner, builder, singer. A maester was made from a boy who had learned to count fish. A midwife was learned by a girl who had not feared blood. A man who had killed a man made shoes so well that very old men walked like very young ones. And sometimes at night, when the wind came off the sea and the taste of salt was like a finishing sentence, Nylalera stood in the doorway of the hall that had become a place men came to simply to breathe a moment, and she listened to the sound that we make when we are sleeping without fear for that hour. It is a sound like a great creature at rest. It is a sound like a promise being kept without the need to name it. In those hours she did light the candle now and again, because hope does not like to be left out of the room. The green flame stood and regarded her with its steady, impolite curiosity. She showed it nothing but her face, which is perhaps the most dangerous and most generous thing one can show. In it, the candle might have seen, if flames see, and if what they see they remember, a winter road drawn straight as a cut across white, and men walking it into their own stories. It might have seen water that is not river and not sea, but something older, and hands bringing blocks of ice the way in summer they bring fruit. It might have seen a boat whose sails were not honest, and a man with a crown like a question. It might have seen a girl with ink on her fingers writing names faster than a city could grow. The candle did not speak. Flames have the advantage of knowing when silence is the most articulate thing in the room. Nylalera pinched it out with the gentleness she would use on a child's candle after a birthday wish, and stood in the dark with the after-image in her eye like a promise the world had made her, and intended, a little obstinately and a little shyly, to keep. Night pulled its velvet over the river by slow degrees, not so much dark as a deepening of color, as if the painter had decided to go over everything again with a richer hand. In that hour between working and washing, between eating and sleeping, Nylalera walked alone along the bank, where reeds made small music and the shallow slip of fish against the shore sounded like a whispered correction. The ground had learned her weight. It let her pass with only the smallest complaint. Fireflies found each other in the low meadows and made a parish of light the wind could not disturb. A man at the edge of the small town sat on the block of stone he had been arguing with all day, his hands hanging like tired dogs. He looked up, saw her, and smiled the way men smile when they see a fire they had not expected and discover it is theirs to sit beside. "Princess," he said, not as to a figure in a story, but as to the woman who had walked into his kitchen and set her cloak on the chair. "If you have a moment, there is a crack I have been talking to that refuses to understand reason." She went and set her palm against the obstinate plane. The stone knew the sea and the fire both, and had taken a long time to agree to be anything else. She listened, as if listening might be a tool. "It wants to be turned," she said at last. "This side has looked west too long. Give it the river, and it will stop pretending to be shore." Together they shifted it with a lever and a grunt, and the near-profane intimacy men share with inanimate things when they make them useful. The crack went quiet. The man who had fought wars, and for whom this victory made a better story for his children, grinned and shook his head. "By rights," he said, "I should be ashamed to have a princess tell me which way a stone likes to face. By rights, I am only glad." When she came back to the hall, Septon Corwin had all but vanished under a mountain of loaves. The Bakers' Guild of a town that did not yet have a guild had decided to bring bread to the new hall to see whether their bread would be eaten, which is the most honest of examinations. Corwin had blessed each loaf with the same short word he used upon good weather, and now he was attempting to enter their subtle differences into a ledger with Lana's help. "This one," he said, tapping a crust that gleamed like polished chestnut, "is possessed of pride. This one," he stroked a flower-pale bull as if it might purr, "is humble, and will forgive butter its trespasses. This, I fear, is vain. It will crack its own self to show it is crisp." "They will not sell to you if you insult the loaves," Lana said gravely, her quill making neat rows of description that would later be of no use and do everyone a great deal of good. "Let them bar me from their ovens," Corwin said, pretending outrage and performing gratitude. "I shall sit outside and apologize to the steam." Maester Lymond had peeled himself away from that performance to establish the beginnings of a physic garden behind the hall, where the soil had a mind of its own, and insisted on remembering what had grown there before. He spoke to it as to a horse unused to the bit. Under his hands, Mint remembered to be humble. Rue remembered to respect its neighbors. He set Valyrian along the fence where the geese would discuss it with interest but not enough courage to pluck, and a row of garlic with a soldier's neatness. "If men will not learn to wash their hands," he muttered, "they will at least carry the scent of virtue with them. You could set a bowl of water at the door and call it a holy thing." Corwin called from the bread mountain, "They will wash for God if not for the maester." "I will take God's help when he is in the mood to give it," Lemon said without heat. "And when he is not in the mood, I will take vinegar." Benedar came in later from the far end of the new road, with a smear of clay up one side, and the grin of a man who has found a trick in a stubborn machine. "We lay the track wider on the bend," he said, "and the carts keep their tongues. The slope listens if you talk to it early and not late. The horses approve. The woman from the lakes was right. The mud here remembers past offenses and repeats them unless we show it better manners." He ate bread like a pilgrim who has earned a sacrament and sat a while by the low fire speaking to no one at all and to everyone present. Nylara watched him and thought of Old Town's bells, and the look on his face when home had broken the surface of his voice. Here, he made no secret of it. He was becoming at home by rising before the sun, by counting nails, by remembering this hill's small moods. Attachment, she knew, is built stitch by stitch, look by look, until one day you find you have woven a place around yourself and it holds. 2 days after the festival, the storm forecast by the man from Storm's End came ashore in a dress the color of old iron and lace of white. It began far out and had steadied itself by the time it reached them, so that it was not rage, but insistence. The river humped its back, and the pier remembered fear. Benedar had men cut the ropes, not to surrender the new moored raft to the flood, but to learn how the river pulled when it meant its work. The raft whipped and then steadied, teaching. Children were sent inside the hall, and promptly turned the dark space underneath the side tables into a fleet of ships, and a monastery, and a dragon's cave, and a castle. It is a rare day when the same table is not all four. Balix did not fly. He set himself on the highest of the 3 hills, and lowered his wings in a line with the slope to break the wind for the half-built storehouse. The shape of him altered the weather's intentions just enough to be noticed. Then men could take that advantage and do the rest. Lana, convinced the geese were likely to be thrown into the sky by accident and sent to the moon, rescued them into the physic garden and scolded them into morality. Maester Lymond, seeing his rue flatten its ears, sent the children to collect stones and lay them around the beds in small circles. A lesson in wall building. A game of boundaries. Septon Corwin went to the door and looked out into the rain, the way a man looks into a face he cannot help but love, even when that face is difficult. "We are grateful," he told it. "We could be a little less grateful if you like." The rain behaved as rain does when asked for mercy. It did not hear him. He smiled anyway, and set the bowls he had set for holiness under the eaves to catch the runoff, and then carried them inside for washing. In the evening, when the storm had burned itself into a gray regard, a cockleshell boat came spinning down from upriver, its oars like a pair of desperate hands. A boy crouched in it with his arms around his knees. He had the particular loosening in his mouth that grief gives a face all at once. Benedar went to the edge with a rope, and Nylara went to the edge with quiet in her body, and the dragon lay on the hill with the patience of a mountain that has remembered it was once fire. "Boat," Benedar said to the boy, "because sometimes you must call the world by its plainest names to get its attention. We have you. Give the river its due, and then give us yours." He threw the rope and the river decided, magnanimously, to let them have it. The boy did not speak when they drew him in, but he put his hand on Nyalara's sleeve with the absolute conviction children have when they have picked the right adult out of a crowd. He carried an object tightly wrapped in oilcloth. Lana helped him unwrap it with the solemnity of unwrapping the bones of a saint. Die. Inside was a ledger, Rosby ink, Rosby hand, its pages swelled with water, its entries blurred. In the front cover, in a square of dry wood that had not taken wet yet, there was a name written in a careful hand. Davin, son of no house of the bank, employed of the counting house, the quick boy. He looked at Nylara, with eyes that had known and would always know hunger. "My master," he whispered, and the hole in his voice told the rest. The counting house had been low and proud, and had taken the river into itself as an ungracious guest. Nylara set her hand on the ledger that had a boy's name in it. "All right," she said. "We will give your master's numbers back to him as far as we can, and what we cannot, we will make new entries for. You will show us where the porkers are counted and where the fines are levied, and where the little men hide their coins from their wives. We will write the names of what the river took and what the river gave. We will write your name at the bottom of a clean page and let it dry." Davin's chin rose 1 degree. "Yes, my lady," he said, as if he had been given a uniform that fit. Maester Lyman took the book and began the slow alchemy of sand and pressure and patience, with heat near but not too near. Corwin, without asking, lifted a corner of his gray-blue cloak and wrapped the boy's shoulders in a small mountain of warmth. Lana, who had already decided there would be 2 inks in the new place, one common and one that could not be confused when tears fell on it, sat with Davin and showed him how you dry a page with breath like you are blowing out a candle, but you do not want to kill it, only persuade it to sleep. After the storm, when it had left everything sharper as storms do, and had weighted the long grasses so that they lay down and considered the sky, travelers came who had waited for the worst part to pass, which is a bad instinct in a soldier and a good one in a trader. Among them were men from further up the Blackwater and from the Trident who looked at the pier with covetous relief, as if it might at last be the place where difficult goods are unloaded into easier hands. And there was a man with a face like char and a mouth like a healed cut, who had something in a cloth that was heavier than the cloth should have allowed. He unwrapped it on Nylara's table, and for a moment the room brightened as if a candle had been lit. Valyrian steel has that trick, even when it has been badly treated and poorly loved. The blade was too long by a hair and too short by a finger, as if the man who had made it had been interrupted, and had known it, and finished anyway. It had been nicked by someone ignorant enough to try to hack bone with it. It had not been oiled. It had not been spoken to. "I heard tell," the man said, as if speaking to rain, "that your people make like this and mend like this. I would ask only the mending. He had not touched the blade's edge in showing it. Some respect cannot be taught. It is either born in a person or not. Nylara looked at the sword that had been made by a dead man whose sons still breathed on the other side of the sea, and in their breathing kept certain secrets from melting. We mend what we have wrought, she said. We do not give what we have kept. I can have it trued. I can give it back the song it had. I can ask no price for that beyond oil and care, and that it be used by a hand that has no joy in killing. If you wish more, I will send you across the sea to speak to men who will give you 1 coin less than you deserve, and 1 lesson more than you desire. Then so. The man nodded, as if this were more generosity than he had expected. Mend it, he said simply. It will not kill a man for joy while I hold it. It was sent down to the smithy, where the joysmith sat like a blunt prophet, and talked to metal in a voice that was older than his own. He did not heat the blade much. He showed it itself under a light and asked it to find its old course. It did. Joysmiths are born with a disease. They must be near the sound of pinging metal, or they lose their sight. The smith had been in danger of losing his sight for 10 years. The sword restored him. When it came back, the man's face altered by a degree so small, only a woman who had spent her life looking at faces would have seen it. He paid nothing. He wrote his name with Lana's hand guiding his, and left with his sword wrapped in cloth and respect. A rider came west along the sea road with a banner whose blue had forgotten how to fade in the sun. The ford and the trout upon it. He came from the riverlands, not as a challenge but as a courtesy, to see the new thing that lay at the river's mouth. He had Riverrun's plainness about him and Riverrun's careful way of liking you. He stood on the hill in the evening beside Benedar, and spoke of bridges, the way some men speak of sisters, with exasperation and pride. The old timber will not keep, he said. You mean to have a city, you will need a bridge that remembers it is expected to live longer than the men who inaugurate it. Stone costs dear, but the Blackwater has a spine under it if you know where to place your feet. The ford is for cattle and summer and men who prefer to be famous for drowning. The bridge is for winter and granaries and letters carried dry. Now, Captain, Benedar said. He remembered names carefully and the habits of men. Do you drink? Only in company, the Tully man said instantly, then laughed. And alone. But in this case, in company. They bent over a rough scratched plan on a plank that would become a door, and drew a bridge of 3 arches with piers that wore triangular noses to split winter's ice. A bridge is a promise. It says, we intend to be here tomorrow. Nylara came and watched their chalk become an argument, and the argument become a compromise good enough to survive, which is the proper end of arguments. Names, she said after the chalk had gone quiet. For what? Benedar asked, half absent, letting a fraction of weight test the line of the center arch for weakness. For this, she said, gesturing lightly at everything. That, princess, said the Tully man, is for children 50 years from now. We will call it the bridge, because that is what it is, and they will call it after the fool who dies building it, or the beauty who once stood upon it, or the king who never paid for it, Bendau, or the queen who refused to cross it in a storm, Corwin offered from behind a loaf, or the dragon who learned to sleep on it because the stones were warmer than the hill, Lyman said. The others laughed, and Valix on the far slope opened one eye, as if deciding whether to take offense, and then decided to accept tribute. A raven came from Dragonstone with a Narian's hand in its folded paper. Nylara recognized the way he crossed his T's as if he were officially bracing them against wind. He wrote of the sea on their side, and of a woman from Valyria, who had visited with hair that had once been as black as his temper, and was now white, and how she had set Valix's brother to playing with the rope of her cloak, as if he were a cat and the dragon a dull nephew. He wrote of the conclave who had asked whether Old Town's men had noticed the candle, and how he had told them, with elegance, to mind their own magic. He sent a ring that had once been set upon the finger of a boy they had loved and lost, who had drawn maps on his boots and then followed them. He said, wear it if you like, keep it in a drawer if you do not. Either way it will be warmed by our thinking of you. She wore it on a chain where only she would see it. It touched her skin and told a story only she could hear. Men from the Vale came finally, not on horses and not on foot, and not by letter, but by way of a man with a peculiar patience. He had gray in his hair in the careful way of men of the mountains, where gray arrives at the temples first, as if to scout. He stood at the edge of the hall and waited until the person whose eyes measured room saw him. Nyalara went to him. He bowed not to the dragon, and not to the priest, and not to the hall, but to a woman who had set her hand on a stone. "My lady," he said, and the accent was that of a man whose words have learned to go carefully around certain slopes. "I am Harold, who has no wish to fall from anything. My lord has asked me to see whether you are, as you say, Bendawander." "And what do I say?" Nyalara asked. "You say you are a guest," he said. "You say you will not take a thing men do not wish to give." "Then I am as I say," she answered. "You may test me. I have brought walnuts," he said unexpectedly. "The Vale has too many. They fall on the roads and make the roads unfaithful. We would trade them for salt fish, which we have too little of. My lord will not be made ridiculous in this. If you cheat me, I will say you cheated me, and he will laugh at you. If you do not cheat me, I will eat walnuts in winter and speak well of you when the eagles listen." Meow. She took the walnuts in her hands and weighed them. They were heavy and had the dry perfume of patience. "The Vale will not be ridiculous," she said. "We will sell you fish so cheap you will suspect us of a plot. And you will discover the plot is that we prefer our roads uncluttered by walnut shells." And so the first caravan of the Vale turned its wheels toward the river. On the way back, it lost one cart to a bend that had not been properly taught yet, and it lost no men. In the telling afterward, the cart became 3 and the men became 5, which is how stories teach men to be careful. Harold learned to play draughts with Benadar, and to lose with grace to Lana, who counted moves with her lips and smiled politely at men who thought to be kind by letting her win. News came from the north with the smell of cold stones and smoke that does not trouble to rise. It came not by raven or letter, but by a man wrapped about with furs like a delivered child. He had knuckles that had fought with winter and mostly won. He was not the Stark himself, but if you have ever met the North, you know the North sends men who could be. He stood in the doorway and set himself to thaw the way Northerners thaw, by standing still and letting the heat come to him as if it were a dog, and he a very slow, very confident master. "I am called Branford," he said when enough of his face had reached back to living for voice to be allowed out. "The Lord of Winterfell knows of you in the way we know of storms before they move. He is curious. He sends no judgment and no fear." "Bow. Then he sends us a kindness," Nyalara said, and indicated the bench near the fire as if she were showing a foreigner how to sit. "Do you bring needs or only names?" "The wall needs," Branford said simply, and the hall altered subtly, the way rooms do when the oldest things are named in them. "We are to speak plain at first and then polite later if we can. The watch is short of men who can write and short of blades that do not break when winter is impatient, and short of men who do not drink themselves to sleep because they cannot stand someone else's eyes in the dark. If you are as you say, you are not kings, but you have long memories and mountains that eat fire." He asks, "Can you send the wall a thing that will not break, and a man who will not break, and a word that will hold shape when men's breath freezes?" Nyalara set her palms on the table and felt the grain, the history of the tree folded into it like a map, in her skin. The candle had shown her a bird on the wall, and far beyond it, something that moved without heat. "We will not send Valyrian steel," she said, because truth must be said first and without apology. "We will send iron that remembers its promise. We will send oil for lamps and oil for joints. We will send men who know how to look at white and see shapes. We will send a surgeon who has sewn up a man's hand with sinew and not panicked when that man bit him for the pain. We will send wool from the south, even if your men will laugh at it and say your wool is better. They will be right, but sometimes it is not the quality that saves you, but the quantity. We will send 2 men who have read books, and 2 men who have not but will learn to read up there. We will send women if they ask, though I suppose you will not ask. We will not send a dragon. We will not send claims. We will write a letter that will not turn to water when someone weeps on it. Many. Branford nodded slowly, and the nod carried in it a distance and a law. You speak like someone who has looked long, he said. I will carry that back. The Lord will answer you by the time your men cross the neck. And your winter? Corwin asked like a man asking a god whether he intends rain for the wedding. Is it early? It is winter, Branford said, and his mouth allowed itself a humor as bare as the north. It always feels early when it arrives. That is its pride. They set aside food and tools and letters. They selected men, and if the men cried at night, they did so quietly. A boy who had never seen snow, except as a far white line against a far blue line, volunteered himself. Because he wanted to write his name in a place where ink froze. Lana packed him a tin of salt she had stolen, and then confessed, and was forgiven, and told she should steal better in future. Badix watched from the hill with the same still attention he gave to stars. He liked very hard problems, such as when to sleep, and very easy ones, such as whom to burn. He had been asked to perform neither and bore this abstinence with dignity. From Old Town, with the return of Benedor's messenger, came a second envoy of a different kind. Archmaester Molos, whose green link had made Nyalara initially hopeful, and whose mouth, when it opened, made her wish briefly for an iron link instead. He had the manner of a man who has been allowed into rooms for so long that he has forgotten that all rooms were once closed. He wished to see the candle. He wished to see who lit it. He wished to see how the light behaved when he asked it to do tricks that had nothing to do with light. You have much, he said in a tone that hovered near gentleness and refused to land. We have much. We could be useful to one another. If, for example, the candle travels, it is known to behave ill. We could keep it safe for you. We keep our own fire, Nyalara said very softly. The way one speaks to an animal that has mistaken your hand for food. You are very young, he added, almost as an afterthought. Older than some, said Anarian's ring against her skin with a shift she felt rather than heard. Corwin, who had a sudden and very intense interest in the line of ants along the sill, did not say what he wanted to say about the ways of men in halls. Lemond, who had learned in Old Town how to love the citadel and how to disagree with it without burning it down, offered the Archmaester a tour of the Physic Garden that lasted 3 hours and involved long explanations of soil. Men who insist on opening one door are often very slow to remember. There are many doors. Sometimes it is a kindness to lead them out another way while they are still arguing with the first's handle. The Archmaester, thwarted without insult, took notes in a clean, crisp hand and returned to Old Town with a bag of rue seed and a sense of his own fairness. In his report he would praise the garden and the order and the cleanliness, and omit the part where a common girl had told him that his boot heel would do better not to crush the seedlings. He would, however, remember it when he knelt at his bedside, for even Archmaesters once knelt somewhere, and asked the mother for forgiveness for the moments when he had meant to educate and had instead only interrupted. From the islands of the Ironmen, another boat came, not to trade, not to boast, but to ask a question with a look. The man who stepped ashore had the sea in his beard, like a thing not yet fully let go. He wore no iron on his chest, and all his iron in his eyes. He stood where the dragon could see him, and the dragon breathed, and the man did not blink. We have a boy, he said without preamble. He was taken by a sickness that makes the knees stones. He is young enough to be forgiven and old enough to be punished. And the women say a maester knows how to coax knees into remembering. We would pay you in songs or in salt wives you do not want and cannot keep. We would pay you in the memory of sparing our boats when our men are fools. Will you send a man with us and let him return without strangling him for his teaching? Done? Nyalara looked at Lymond. Lymond looked at the dragon. The dragon looked at the clouds. Corwin looked at the man and saw, under the rust and the salt, a father who had no word for ask, and had said it anyway. Go, Nyalara said. Go with him. Bind the boy's knees, and bind this man's mouth if he becomes impatient. Take Brewer with you. He has hands that remember the way joints are supposed to whisper to one another. You will return with a little gold, because it matters to them that they paid it. and with songs, because those matter to me. You will return with a new way to knot rope, because those matter to Benedor. And if they try to keep you, say my name, and if they try to drown you, say the dragons. And if they try to make you sleep where men have died and not been forgiven, say Corwin's prayer with a voice that suggests God is your uncle, and he owes you a favor. No. The Iron Men blinked, which was the closest he would come to gratitude, and he spat into his hands and rubbed them together and said, We will not drown a man who brings a boy back to his feet. We will not keep him more than the sea keeps a storm. He took Lymond and Brewer away, and in a week they came back with salt in their eyebrows, and a boy who put his feet down carefully, as if trying on a new kind of walking, which he was. They came back with a song about a woman who had set her lover's beard on fire while he slept, and his great amusement at being awakened so. And they came back with a way to tie the new rafts, so that they creaked like old men, but did not part like the hair of young ones. In the quiet that followed the storm and the Ironman and the Archmaester and the Northern Man and the Tully Bridge, there slipped in little things that mattered more than any of it when you put them all together. A woman whose baby turned in the right direction at the right moment, because the midwife had slept that night and not been kept awake by cold. Nealara took in those days as if they were the only riches she had ever wanted. She went to the edge of the water and put her hand in it, and taught herself its temperature, the way you teach yourself the temperature of a loved one's skin. She watched the geese learn the order of the garden. She learned the names of men who would never sit in a hall, but would decide, with their hands and their silence, whether the hall deserved to stand. Once, when the sky had decided to be thin as onion skin, and the light broke it like someone tearing paper slowly, Anarion came. He did not arrive with heralds. He came in a small boat with two men who had learned to row in youth, and had not forgotten the economy of old skills. He set his foot on the pier, and felt the pier's skeletal pride under his weight, and nodded once. He had not often been a man who cried at the sight of timber, but men need not have done a thing often for it to be true. She did not embrace him until later, and when she did, it was not the embrace of a princess, and the conclave's favored instrument. It was the embrace of a girl whose father had been the sea, and whose mother had been maps, and who had by good fortune been given a grandsire who lacked the energy for cruelty. He put his hands on either side of her face and regarded her as if she were an interesting new country. You have found a way to make your face look like a place, he said. She took him up the nearest hill and showed him the lines that had begun to score themselves into the dirt, and the place where the school would be even if they did not call it one, and the place where the market set itself like a broody hen and refused to be moved. He walked like a man measuring the ribs in a new-built ship. Do you love it? He asked at last. He did not ask if she would stay. He did not ask if she would leave. He asked the question that mattered. I love that I do not have to pretend in order to speak with the wind, she said. And his mouth softened. They stood a while in companionable disdain of the distant claims of kings. Anarion had been sent by men who meant to tally the gold and the goodwill both. He had decided on seeing a girl's name written on a ledger where it had no legal right to be, and every moral one, that the latter was the only coin worth taking back. He remained 3 days and did nothing that anyone would later write a ballad about. He ate stew and was kind to a man whose breath was poor and whose story was poorer. And he sat with Lana and taught her a Valyrian letter she had thought too difficult, and us with a second thought in it. And he put his fingers into the mortar of the bridge and came away with a tiny pearl of grit that he kept in his pocket as if it had been given him. On the third night he sat with Nealara while the candle burned, and neither of them spoke for a long time. At last he said, Do you dream it? Not in ways that help, she said honestly. I dream the shape of things. I dream a hill like a shoulder. I dream white. I dream boats. I do not dream what men say, or how they hold their knives. I do not dream of fire unless I am already lighting it. He nodded. Perhaps that is better. If the world wished to write itself down and hand it to us, it would be too proud to do so honestly. It is proud enough to speak to us in hints and then laugh when we mistake the subject. They smiled together at the world, which continued to ignore men's laughter as it ignores their tears. He left at dawn, having found 30 small reasons to return and 5 to stay away, and trusting himself with none of them. As autumn pressed itself like a heavy good coat across the shoulders of the 3 hills, a group of men arrived from the Fingers with hands shaped by nets and the peculiar energy of men who have learned to talk to lonely places. They had no lord at their back and no letter in their pocket. They had 3 knives like leaves and a way of holding themselves as if nothing that could happen could surprise them, and as if everything that could happen might yet be kind. One of them, whose hands were stained with the red of shellfish and who had the mild eyes of a cow and the patience of a snare, said, "We hear you build. We hear your dragon does not burn men unless told to by someone who would be ashamed afterward. We hear you will let a man set a pot down and take it up again at night, and no one will have eaten his stew. We would like to build with you. And now, what do you want?" Nylara asked, because a city's foundation stones must be mortared with honest answers, or they crack when a certain kind of frost comes. "We would like to be allowed to go away," he said with that northern indirection that isn't, "and to be allowed to come back. We would like to be allowed to change our minds about what we are without being punished by men who prefer us in a previous shape." Nylara had learned enough to know that was the truest desire of most of the world. "Then come," she said. "We will fail you in it sometimes, and so will you fail us, but we will try." They set their pots down where pots ought to be, and their children learned the river's vowels, and their women and men learned the way the reeds show you where there will be a bird later if you are good. One of their daughters taught Lana a song about counting fish, that was also about how to wait for someone you love without growing thin. Lana taught her the High Valyrian word for patience, which in that tongue is built out of the bones of the word for heart. The bridge began. It began like all bridges, with men getting and dropping things, with measurements done twice and cut once, and then once again, because someone had laughed at a joke about a goose. It began with a stone that would not be moved and taught them where the wall wanted to rest its weight. Benedar lived with it as if the bridge were a person he meant to marry, and he was learning its stubbornness so he could love it properly. He kissed his fingertips and pressed them to its belly before the first arch stood. Men laughed at him, and then, when the arch went up and did not come down again after the first frost, kissed their fingers too and did not insist upon it when anyone watched. From Highgarden, not the man with the hair and the manner like sunshine, but a woman with brown clever hands and a braid around her head like an idea tightly held, came plans for a mill, wheels that would turn under the black water's mood and make grain think better of itself. She smiled at the dragon and was not much interested in the princess because princesses are common and good wheels are rare. She walked the riverbank with Lyman, arguing about what the water thinks when it rises, and she drank Corwin's clean water and said, "If your god requires so much wine, you must either have very good vintners or a very small god." And he laughed like a bell dropped into a basin. Winter made itself known not with snow. This was no Winterfell, but with a new angle of light, with breath that made a visible grammar in front of mouths, with a different music in the reeds. The ironman sent a basket of weirdly beautiful shells and a cloth that had been worn by a woman whose hair had shone like oil, and they sent a letter too, which did not contain words so much as a way of writing that suggested words had happened once and might again. Lyman translated it by a method that involved cursing and a glass bead and success. It said, "The boy runs. We have not drowned your man. If your dragon wishes to see the sea near our island, he may do so if he leaves our boats to their simple ambitions." Nylara wrote back, "The dragon will look at your island only with one eye, which is less rude. Send us a knot with a story, and we will send you away to cure a cough that has defeated your wives." From Sunspear came actual oranges in a box lined with leaves that had traveled farther than most men will, and were as green as the day they were cut. There came too a woman with wrists like ropes and eyes like summer. She wore a scarf over her head that made the room warmer by its existence. She danced not in the hall, but on the pier, for the pier wanted a blessing, and she made of her feet a small domestic miracle. The men from the Fingers forgot to be cold for a while. She taught Lana a word in her own tongue for the sound a snake makes when it decides not to bite you. Lana taught her the word in High Valyrian, for the shape the river makes, when it forgives a mistake. The Stark's answer came back before the men did, which is a rare kindness for letters. It said, "I have seen the hand that wrote this. It does not tremble. Send your men. We will not make them into what they are not. The wall does that anyway. If they survive, they will write me their names. I would have your counsel when spring comes and the rivers unfreeze and men go outside if they can. The North is not always polite, but it often means well." He wrote his name as if it were the only word he had ever had reason to be interested in. Eddard or Brandon, or a name of that sort, wearing its letters plain as good wool. One night, when even the geese had exhausted their opinions, Nylara woke to a sound that at first seemed to be only wind, and then, in the way of certain winds, arranged itself into words. It came not from the candle, which was dark on purpose, but from the hill. She rose and went out barefoot into a cold that made the skin remember the order of all its small hairs. Balak stood above the half-city like someone keeping watch over a child who had a fever, not frantic, not agitated, alert beyond rest. He lowered his great head as she came near and touched his nose to her shoulder, with a gentleness that sometimes makes men more afraid than any show of force. She put her palm against the soft place where the scales refined into something like the inside of a shell. The night told her what it could. It told her of a boat farther out than any small sensible boat should be, and of men upon it who had forgotten how to read the messages water sends, when it means to be generous again in the morning and mean now. She went to the pier. She woke Benedar. She woke Corwin and Lymond, and 3 of the Valyrian men who slept in the room where the smell of tar had taken up permanent residence. They put a little boat into the water with a speed that was almost rude, and a silence that was almost piety. Valix watched them go, then unfurled his wings, then furled them again, remembering the promise not to throw his shadow over houses. He took the sky from the far side of the hills and crossed over the mouth of the river, where the land kept its breath. And when he reached the boat whose wind had lost patience, he did a small, terribly precise thing. He breathed once, not upon the boat, but upon the wind above it. Heat rises and changes stubbornness. The little wind remembered to blow from the right direction. The sail filled. The men remembered to be men. They made the river with their own sweat and curses. When they came in under the dragon and the stars, they were crying because they had been let to live in a world that had no particular reason to care. Benedar swore at them kindly and Corwin blessed them sternly, and Lyman made them drink something that tasted like evil, and saved one man's lungs. Nylara stood barefoot and thought of the larger mercies the world gives on its clumsiest days, and how small gestures, turning a stone, warming a wind, are sometimes the only miracles we are trusted with. As the day shortened, they set up lamps along the paths that wanted to be streets. They were not fine lamps, they were cunning, and they were grateful both. Children were instructed to light them in a set order, up the hill, down the slope, across by the lathe shed, and the tool yard and the baker's. And Lana took to going behind the smallest to make sure the smallest had remembered. Men came home easier for those little sons. Men quarreled less at the edges of paths lit for them by children. The darkness still was, but it seemed to have been reminded of its limits. The first death came not with horns or solemnity, but with a soft closing of a woman's mouth who had simply gotten to the end of her road. She had sat by the door for 3 days, watching the light behave itself on the floorboards, and she had laughed when the geese complained, and she had put her hand on Lana's head as if to measure her for a hat. Then she had slept, and when Lyman leaned close, he found his own breath, the only one left in the room. Her daughter, who had supposed herself a woman and now discovered herself a child, sobbed once like a person falling through ice and then went very quiet. The hall became patient around their patient sorrow. Corwin sat with them and said nothing in a way that was the best prayer a man can say. Nylara wrote the woman's name on a small piece of wood in 2 tongues, and then gave it to the daughter, who hung it on a nail above the bed, where the old woman would not sleep again. It is important to give the dead a place to remain, even if you are an atheist about ghosts. They buried her in the field, where the ground did not mind being opened, and the dragon watched from the hill, as if to learn what men do with their own ashes when they have not been made into fire by someone else. That night, The daughter came and laid a spoon on Nyalara's table. She loved this one. She said, "Keep it and stir with it sometimes so that she will not forget this place." Nyalara took the spoon and stirred with it the next morning, and burned the porridge and laughed, and said aloud into the empty air what you would say to a woman who had made porridge well for 50 years, which is, "It is harder than it looks." The settlement kept its breath around that, and the children played a small game in which the stones were people, and the river a very strict school, and everyone agreed to enjoy losing. On a day like soundless glass, a boy with a red cap came with a message from the west. The Lion Lord invited not a presence, but a look. He had heard that the dragon did not burn, and he had heard that the princess did not rule, and he had heard, above all, that there were men at the river mouth who would build and forget to ask who owned the river, which is an admirable quality in builders and a difficult one in a lord. Nylara went with Benadar and with Lymond and with Corwin, who would keep them respectable by looking like a conscience, and she went with no more than a dozen horse. The Lion's road was well taught. It ran with a surety that suggested it had been given good lessons when it was tender. The rock rose out of the west the way certain kinds of pride do, less gaudy than it has been accused of being, and more patient. The Lord received them in a hall where the gold did not show itself stupidly, but could be felt in the way men breathed, in the way the cloth fell. He had the careful arrogance of a man who has taught himself to tolerate fools, because there are so many of them, and the careful humility of a man who knows he will be widely hated if he does not. "You have a city without a king," he said. "We have a river without a master," Nyalara answered. "These are the same things said differently," he said, not unkindly. "Be careful that the world does not make a king for you. It does that sometimes, when it cannot bear to let a thing be free. If it does," she said, and lowered her eyes, "not at all. I will refuse him hospitality." He laughed like a man who makes a point of enjoying wit even when it threatens him, which is either courage or a method of warfare. He took them down into the belly of the rock and showed them shelves of salt cod and of lavender, and of carefully kept oaths. And he showed them the place where the rock remembers that it has bones and that the bones have a music. He asked her, as if discussing the price of olive oil, whether her dragon would be offended if his own men practiced shooting arrows in its presence. "My dragon," Nyalara said, "has more immediate concerns. We would prefer to practice our friendship without arrows in it." "Da." He nodded as if that had been the right answer to a test, and sent them away with a spool of gold thread, which is the sort of gift that is either kind or an insult, depending on how you hold it. Nyalara held it as if it were nothing, because she had learned to think of gold as a polite metal, like a certain kind of man, useful for tying things and for being melted down and for hanging on people's ears, but not particularly instructive. They returned to the river. The bridge stood 2 arcs and a half then, and the third waited for the winter to finish its sentence. The school had found its wall, and the wall had found its chalk. Lana, who had begun with door and bread and light, now kept column on column in 2 tongues, and felt no more frightened of the tall letters than she had of the dragon's big eye. Davin, who had rescued a book from drowning, had learned to make a new book with better paper and a spine that did not think too much of itself. One of the women from the Fingers had begun to teach the children to mend nets, which is an art of patience, and the beginning of teaching someone to mend their own heart. On the first crisp morning when the air could be broken, an old man came with a sack over his shoulder that clinked. He had tongs at his belt, and the look of a man who might have been important somewhere else, and had chosen to be unimportant here. He asked for the use of a corner near the forge, and a place near the water. He set his sack down and out poured not coins but shards of glass, the green of old bottles, the brown of new ones, clear glass that had forgotten who it had been, blue like the rope of the sky in certain weathers. He set up a small furnace, and he began to melt what had been broken, and persuade it to be useful. Children gathered and were shooed, and then were invited to put their faces close enough to feel their eyebrows singe, and then were shooed again. "What do you make?" Lana asked, because someone had to ask, and she was usually the one brave enough to say a thing before it had learned what it wanted to be. "Windows," the old man said. The kind that do not break when men are clumsy. The kind that remember summer in winter, and remember winter in summer. And glass that makes reading easier for men who have forgotten their arms are as long as they once were. And glass that colors water and makes poor water look good without lying about what it will do to you if you drink it. And perhaps, he added very casually, like a man suggesting dessert when he has already eaten a whole feast, things that will remember the night. She looked at him out of the corner of her practical child's eye. Like candles made of sand. Like that, he said, and smiled with a mouth that had very few teeth, and one that was gold, not because he was vain but because it had been necessary once to fill a hole, and that was what he had had in his hand. But slow, and not here, and with permission, and perhaps not at all if permission is not the point. Then now one day, she nodded as if she had decided to trust him and would reevaluate in spring. That winter, he made small things that felt big. A window for the school that did not make the wind angry. A set of cups in which water tasted less of barrel and more of river. A bead that made a fisherman's wife feel accompanied while she mended. He made once a little charm. The glass so thin it trembled in the breath. Shaped like a fish. He hung it in the hall where there was no fish, and where it caught the light, and made of it something like a prayer. It is a mistake to say that nothing ill happened. Things ill happen whenever men gather in number. A man struck another with a clay mug and knocked out a tooth that had been needed for biting apples. A boy stole a crust and a coin and hid in a barrel, and was discovered only because he could not keep from announcing under his breath how very well hidden he was. A woman spoke a cruel word to the wrong person, and discovered that cruel words sometimes find their way back a long road and come to sit in your lap like a cat with bad habits. A hunter lost his nerve at the sight of a boar, and a man he loved fell beneath it and did not rise, and the hunter came to the hall at night and stood under the candle that was not lit and wept like rain on his own boots until Night Alara rose from her bed and said nothing to him but set her hand on his head as if he were a child. That is the kind of magic anyone can do if they remember to. Once, when the ice had set itself thin on the river, and men had convinced themselves it would carry what it did not intend to, a wagon went through, and a horse went with it. It is one thing to lose a horse to age and thrift. It is another to watch one disappear like a bad idea into cold water. Men swore with the kind of helplessness that makes men dangerous to themselves. Felix, who had learned that flying where houses are is poor manners and burning things, is something one avoids unless asked very politely by an enemy to sing, did a strange thing. He descended from his hill, the careful way a great creature learns to walk when it remembers the world is small in places, and he lay down on the bank with his forearms outstretched, so that his body was a bridge that was not a bridge. The men crawled along him, not because they could not have gone upon planks, but because the dragon was warm and said in the grammar of warmth that he would hold. They tied ropes around the wagon. They did not get the horse back. They got a man back who had been trying to learn how to drown and had decided against graduating. When it was done, Felix did not demand applause. He lumbered up the hill and slept, because he had been awake in a way that is not rest. The next morning, Lana put her palm against his knee and said, "Thank you," in her careful high Valyrian, and the dragon blinked a blink that might have been incomprehension, and might have been the dragon kind of fondness. The bridge took its last stone with a ceremony that consisted of men spitting on their palms, and women saying honestly that they had doubted it, and were pleased to be proven wrong, and children throwing pebbles into the river, and announcing which pebbles were wishes, and which were curses, upon bad weather. Benedar put his hand on the center of the stone, and did not speak for a very long moment, and then he said, "All right," in such a way that the stone heard him, and agreed that it was, in fact, all right. They crossed it. They crossed it with a goat first, and then with a man, and then with a cart full of barrels that did not fall through. They crossed it with a small band playing instruments that were mostly in tune, and with Corwin blessing it, by the radical method of not attempting to own it with his god. They crossed it with Lana running to the center and holding up her fish glass to the sun, and declaring that light had a new trick now. If anyone named it then, Nydalara did not hear the name. Names come and go. Bridges stand or they do not. And the rest is only the way men remember themselves honest. In spring, when the reeds needed combing, when children could again skirmish barefooted with the privilege of cold mud, when the first of the fruit trees learned to pretend to give leaves, there came two men whom no one would later be able to describe as anything other than precisely themselves. One was carrying a lute with a crack in the back and an expression of carefully curated sorrow. The other was carrying nothing, and had an expression that suggested if he were to begin to carry sorrow, he would break it with one hand. The first sang within an hour, and had a woman crying within 2, which is a talent and a danger. The second did nothing within the hour, and then, within the second, stopped a fight with a word that sounded very like a father calling a boy in from play when rain comes. "Where from?" Benedar asked when the lute was tuned again, and had learned the way the hall liked to take sound. "The road," the lute one said with apology. "The same," said the other without apology. "Can you build?" Nydalara asked them plainly. "I can make women forget their husbands briefly," the singer said, which was not the answer to the question, and was, in its way, perhaps one of the useful crafts. "I can place a stone on a stone and have the second remember, the first is not there to be kicked," the other said, which was exactly the answer to the question. "Then stay. Then go. Then come back. That is the grammar of places that will endure." They offer all three without insisting upon any. The singer stayed long enough to teach Lana a sad song that was not tragic, which is a gift rarer than dragons, and then he went. The other stayed long enough to make a wall shoulder a roof and to sit with Corwin and argue about whether goodness is something one does or something one is, and then he went. Not because he had finished arguing, but because he needed to go remind himself he would argue again tomorrow. By the time the first wheat had set its green illusions, by the time the boats had learned to come in the dusk like tired dogs who know they are loved and have supper, by the time men could touch the flame of the glass candle with their fingers and not be burned if they were careful, the settlement had done the thing Nydalara had wanted it to do and feared it might never do. It had begun to make promises to itself without asking anyone's permission. A woman stood in the market and said to a man, "I will meet you by the third lamp after dark," and both knew which lamp and what they meant. A boy said to a girl, "The river will let us pass if we listen," and she laughed and said, "We will listen," and they did, and it did, and both learned something about the world that no king could teach them. And somewhere far north, under a sky that ate sound, and returned it as a kind of white, a man read men's names who had come from the south with letters that did not run, and with wool that was too fine, and with a surgeon who would not be thanked, and with a prayer that meant only this: "We remembered you." He read those names in a voice that made the ice less proud. He tucked the letter in his cloak. He sent back a message with the same plainness: "Send more names if you have them. We are hungry, but not only for food." Nydalara stood that night on the bridge. It held her the way a good marriage holds: a little give, a little take, a foundational confidence not made loud. The river moved under her, indifferent and interested both. The stars did what stars do, watched without meddling. The candle was not lit. The dragon was asleep on the third hill, with his head under his wing like a child pretending to make darkness. Corwin was writing a letter to a septa he would never send, in which he would say the things men say when they have discovered that God is as stubborn as weather and as tender as bread. Lymond was awake, reading with his finger under the line because he had always done it that way. His chain made a small clucking music when he breathed. Benedar, in the house near the pier, turned in his sleep and reached out a hand. It found nothing. It went back only a little disappointed. She whispered then, not to the candle, and not to the dragon, and not to the river, and not to her grandsire on a rock a day and a half to the east, but to the air in front of her face. "Door," she said, and then, because the words that had begun the place still wanted their turn each night like children: bread, roof, road, light, and then, because she had learned a new one, and because the bridge under her demanded it, and because spring insists, as lovers insist, on being rude and true. Return,